You know, you practice, you drill, and then it comes to the moment and you go live and stuff happens. There we go. Okay, good. So there, I don't know, there may be a little lag in the sync up here on the audio, but technology happens, exactly. So as I am prepping for this here, this is something I have, this video today that we are doing now that is happening is something I've been prepping for years. I've done an awful lot of work on this. And it doesn't all show in this whole thing, but there's a lot we're going to be going over today, a lot. And we're just kind of going to get into it, I think. Because there's not a lot of reason to talk about it. I think we should just get into it. I'm going to be kind of going back and forth between a few different screens here as I navigate, kind of like we did with that with the tone scale, the emotional tone scale video a couple months ago. We're just going to navigate some things here because I got a lot to show you and a lot to talk to you about today in describing this thing. So why don't we just go ahead and get to it? Let's see here. Let me switch over to our start here. Okay. I don't see any reason not to. Let's get to it. So this is an e-meter. What is it? Besides an ugly colored device, it's an electronic device that is used in Scientology. There is nothing special or mystical or unique about this instrument. It simply sends a flow of electricity through a person's body, and it measures how much resistance there is to that flow. That's the most basic and accurate explanation for what it does. L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, pretended he had a hand in creating this device, but he was no electronics engineer, and in fact, demonstrated through his writings and lectures that he had no real idea how electricity works. He made claims about what this device is measuring and how to interpret it, which have convinced a lot of people that this meter does a lot more than they think. But here's the bottom line. The claims he made are total nonsense. In the case of the e-meter, seeing is not believing. We're going to talk about this in detail, a lot of detail. By the end of this video, you will totally understand what Scientologists think about the e-meter and why they believe in it so passionately. I will break down the false information and pseudoscience that L. Ron Hubbard dreamed up about it and show you exactly how Scientologists think it works. Before we get started, I want to be clear that I'm not making this video to teach electronics, and I'm not going to get into circuit boards, electrical diagrams, or argue if this is a Wheatstone bridge or a glorified ohm meter or whatever. I'm not an electronics guy. I'm a psychology guy. This video is about the psychological impact and abuse that is carried out in Scientology using this device. All right, so we've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. Part 1, the history of the e-meter. The process Scientology offers for spiritual counseling is called auditing. I use the term counseling very loosely because no one in Scientology is a licensed ethical therapist. And institutionally, Scientology seeks to destroy psychology and psychiatry. The word auditing comes from audio, which goes back to Latin audere, meaning to hear or listen. A Scientology auditor is supposed to be one who listens. The person receiving the auditing is called a pre-clear, which technically means someone who has not yet achieved the state of clear, on Scientology's step-by-step guide to spiritual enlightenment called The Bridge to Total Freedom. An auditor is supposedly guided by the Auditor's Code, which says that the auditor must not ever evaluate for the pre-clear, tell the pre-clear what to think, or invalidate the pre-clear or his data. The e-meter's movements direct the auditor's actions in a counseling session and are used to steer the attention of the pre-clear, the person receiving auditing. Hubbard said the meter is infallible and is never wrong. It can only be the auditor who is at fault for misinterpreting what the meter says. In any case where the meter may indicate that there is some answer to an auditing question, especially in a Scientology confessional where they are looking for misdeeds, if the pre-clear says there's nothing there or that the meter is wrong, it's the meter that is believed, not the pre-clear. So you can decide for yourself if telling someone the meter is right and they are wrong is a form of evaluation or invalidation. The electropsychometer used in Scientology was invented by Volney Matheson. Hubbard claimed that Matheson was inspired to create the meter after Hubbard told an audience about the idea of electronically measuring thought during a lecture in November of 1950. And Matheson himself did verify this account. Quote, "During these lectures, Ron discussed a device with which an auditor could locate engrams and areas of charge in his pre-clear. One of the students on the course, Volney Matheson, working from Ron's idea, pieced together a meter. This first instrument was eventually, after many years of development under Ron's direction, evolved into what we know today as the e-meter. We do not have a recording or transcript of the lecture in which this data was discussed." End quote. And that is pulled out of the Scientology publication Research and Discovery Series, Volume 5. While it is true that Hubbard gave this lecture and Matheson was in attendance, the backstory here is a little more complicated. As Cy Crit wrote in his thesis on the e-meter's origin, Volney Matheson has his own interesting history with electronics, chiropractic medicine, and pseudoscientific therapies. However, neither individual was as original as they might have liked to think they were in this period. A thriving ecology of fringe therapies and self-help systems were evolving to fill the intellectual space opened up by the new mass media, publishing, and radio. Volney's visualization therapy and Hubbard's Dianetics were but two of many practices which exploited pseudoscientific devices to lend credibility to their claims. Most of them are now extinct and forgotten. Dianetics and Scientology are not original. Their only distinctive feature is that they have survived to the present day. This character of fringe ideas in this period, and especially their use of technological props, was probably influenced by the rapid scientific advances that were taking place and the optimistic attitude the public had toward them. People trusted science and technology to improve everyday life. Hubbard said that after he was presented with Matheson's meter, he and his wife, Mary Sue, spent a good amount of research time plotting the whole track, the collective series of memories going all the way back to the beginning of time, trillions and trillions of years ago. And I mean that literally. Amongst many of Hubbard's more outrageous claims is that carbon dating is so wrong that every scientist has grossly misestimated the actual age of our physical universe. Where astronomers and other scientists have calculated our universe is 13.7 billion years old, Hubbard brushes all that aside and claims it's actually 4 quadrillion years old. His only proof, then and now, for these claims are the revealed memories of pre-clears and auditing sessions recalling incidents from their past lives. Matheson's meters were then sold and used by Scientologists in their auditing. Hubbard produced an operator's manual in 1952 in which he correctly compared the meter's activity with that of a polygraph or lie detector. However, he elaborated on this quite a lot more. So much so that eventually he created an entirely fictional explanation of what the meter is registering and why it reacts to an auditor's questions. Matheson and Hubbard both benefited for a couple of years by their arrangement, with Matheson creating the meters and Hubbard pushing them on Scientologists for use in auditing. It appears from statements later made by Matheson that they had a falling out and Matheson refused to continue manufacturing and distributing his meters for the Church of Scientology. Given the fact that Hubbard was infamous for taking credit for other people's work and was known as a greedy and manipulative con artist by those who were close to him, it's likely that Hubbard tried to usurp full control of the e-meters, but Matheson was the patent holder, and he wasn't going to give that up. By 1955, the Matheson e-meters fell entirely out of use. Hubbard explained it to Scientologists at the time like this, quote, "Yesterday, we used an instrument called an e-meter to register whether or not the process was still getting results so that the auditor would know how long to continue it. While the e-meter is an interesting investigation instrument and has played its part in research, it is not today used by the auditor except perhaps in testing the basal metabolism of the pre-clear. The e-meter is no longer used to determine what is wrong with the pre-clear. As we long ago suspected, the intervention of a mechanical gadget between the auditor and the pre-clear had a tendency to depersonalize the session, and also gave the auditor a dependence upon the physical universe and its meters, which did not have to be there. I knew when we first began to use e-meters that sooner or later something would have to be evolved or that something would turn up which would dispense with them. I worked along that line rather consistently, and about half a year before this writing developed communication lag as the only diagnostic instrument needed by the auditor." End quote from L. Ron Hubbard. The communication lag Hubbard refers to here is simply the amount of time between the auditor asking a question and the pre-clear answering it. This became a diagnostic tool in auditing, but as you can imagine, it wasn't very reliable. Now, as further proof that Hubbard's problem with meters wasn't that they didn't do what he wanted, but that he may have had a cash motive, in 1958, the e-meter reappeared in the world of Scientology. And this time, there was no pesky non-Scientologist inventor to cut into Hubbard's profit margin. Don Breeding, a Scientologist at the time and knowledgeable about electronics, thought that the newly invented transistor could solve certain problems that existed with the old Matheson meters, and he could help Scientology have e-meters again. He came up with a simple 3-transistor configuration, which remains the basis of the e-meter design all the way up to today. Hubbard did not know his way around a circuit board or electronic equipment, but that didn't stop him from putting his name on the new e-meter and claiming a hand in its development. Because of how they are taught about the meter and its history, most Scientologists think Hubbard was far more involved with the nuts and bolts of the e-meter's development than he really was. At its heart, the e-meter is a very simple electric circuit that is configured to do one simple task: measure resistance to an electric current. When a person is holding the meter's electrodes, or cans, the resistance it's measuring comes from the change in water density of a person's skin, and muscle tension causing increased skin contact. Everything else added on top of this explanation is just window dressing or pure nonsense. Part 2, the nature of pseudoscience. Let's take a break for a minute from the meter. When it comes to explaining the e-meter and challenging Hubbard's claims about it, we are faced with one of the biggest challenges in debunking pseudoscience, known as Brandolini's law, or the bullshit asymmetry principle. The amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than that needed to produce it. In other words, it takes no effort at all to tell a convincing and pleasing lie that people want to hear. But it can then take hours to prove that lie to be false. And most people do not care enough to invest that time, since it's so much easier to simply believe the lie and carry on with their life, secure in the false knowledge that they have. This persistency of bullshit is not just a joke, but has serious and often deadly consequences. Pseudoscience is any claim, belief, or practice which is presented as scientifically legitimate, but which does not adhere to the scientific method. It's an attempt to sound legitimate by using scientific sounding words or phrases, or claiming work is based on scientific experimentation, research, and peer-reviewed findings, when in fact, it's not. To be blunt, a person who is knowingly pushing pseudoscience is a fraud. And if they're making money from it, they are a thief and a con man, or woman, of which there are plenty. There are far too many people in the world today doing this. And it's only because of people's general ignorance about science that these criminals get away with it. Now, of course, even outside of hard science, it's extraordinarily easy to fool people by showing them one thing and saying it's something else. In areas where people have little real expertise or knowledge, they usually need an authority figure to explain things to them. There is far too much knowledge in this world for any one of us to know all of it. We would never be able to pass on knowledge from one generation to the next if we had to reinvent and reprove the wheel, or vaccines, or pasteurization over and over again. So we rely on individuals who dedicate their professional lives to studying and working across the scientific spectrum to advance our knowledge and make our lives easier as a result. But there are certain mental processes we all use in our thinking that can very easily be taken advantage of. Hubbard knew how easy it was to fool people. In fact, he talked about it in his lectures all the time. Like many other con men, Hubbard liked to openly laugh at his followers without them realizing what he was doing. So let me introduce a couple of concepts that all peddlers of pseudoscience take advantage of. These are key to understanding how people fall for believing Hubbard's claims about the e-meter, and I'll refer to each of these throughout this video. The first one here, of course, being context creates truth. The manner or context in which we learn something has a lot to do with how we view it or what we decide is true or false. For example, if someone whom we believe is an authority figure tells us something, we tend to believe it much more readily than if someone who we have never heard of before tells us. But the problem is there are a lot of people who claim to be experts, but who have no real knowledge at all. They just make things up and pass it off as truth. And when people believe them, that creates a logical fallacy called an argument from authority. Interestingly, if we read something, we tend to believe it more than if we hear it, which is why so many con men write so many books. Now here is another one, confirmation bias. When we are faced with new information, we all have a tendency to search for or interpret that information in a way that confirms our preconceptions or what we've been told to expect or believe. This is called our confirmation bias, and unfortunately, it's something we all suffer from. And because we want to stick with what we know and already believe, we tend to give less consideration to alternative possibilities, or we just reject them without even looking. This is especially true when we have some kind of emotional connection or have deeply held beliefs about something. We feel we need something to be true or real, and so we make it that way in our minds, and we don't let anything challenge that. Our brains are very good at pattern recognition. We are constantly interpreting what our senses tell us against what we already know or what we've already experienced so as to make the unfamiliar more familiar. This is a crucial survival skill, but unfortunately, it can also make us somewhat blind to what is right in front of us. There can be other bad consequences too, including people even selectively forgetting information or memories which do not conform with their beliefs. Confirmation bias can lead to wishful thinking, overconfidence, and very poor decision making because the person will literally nullify anything that does not agree with their ideas, no matter who's telling them or what authority they have. And then there's misdirection. Neville Mescaline said misdirection is, quote, misleading the spectator's senses in order to screen from detection certain details for which secrecy is required, end quote. John Travolta helped explain this even more simply in the movie Swordfish, when he said, what the eyes see and the ears hear, the mind believes. Now, when it comes to the meter, I'm not talking about pointing in one direction so you can do something else when people aren't looking. Another way of thinking about misdirection is to get people to believe one thing is happening when in fact something else entirely is going on. You can make a person believe in almost anything with good enough misdirection. When it comes to the e-meter, we'll return to this in more detail later. Now let's break down what Scientologists are told about how the e-meter works. Part 3, e-meter use in Scientology auditing. In Dianetics and Scientology, mental images or pictures are very important. In 1950, L. Ron Hubbard introduced a theory of mental anatomy and therapy in a book called Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health. He put forward the idea that we perceive and recall what goes on around us through the use of mental image pictures. He also called these facsimiles, meaning that they are three-dimensional recordings or copies of everything that we perceive through our senses. Hubbard claimed that there are roughly 72 pictures taken every second, and all of these are stored in our mind. We don't have to think about this. It's all totally automatic. He said there are two main parts to the mind, the analytical mind and the reactive mind. The analytical mind is the conscious mind that we use to think and compute things and solve problems. If you close your eyes and think of a memory of a cat, Hubbard says it is the analytical mind that furnishes the picture for you from your past experiences or combines past images or ideas to create a picture of a cat using your imagination. The reactive mind is where pictures containing any pain and unconsciousness are stored. These are used against you in moments of tiredness or stress, or when you find yourself in circumstances approximating the earlier times when you were hurt or unconscious. The reactive mind never turns off, but it operates subconsciously, just below your awareness. Therefore, it reacts faster than the analytical mind. It's supposed to keep you from repeating actions or behaviors which caused you pain in the past, but according to Hubbard, it's lost any evolutionary purpose and is just a burden now. Dianetics procedure is supposed to be the method of clearing or erasing the reactive mind entirely. Early on, Hubbard avoided any questions about where pictures might be stored in the brain. He claimed to have done the math years prior and figured there was no way any brain could store all their memories, since there simply weren't enough punched protein molecules to store every perception of every moment in our lives. So, deciding there was no physical way possible for memory to work the way it does, Hubbard said these pictures are made up of sheets of energy and have actual mass. It's a very tiny amount of mass, but is supposedly measurable. When a person is recalling a memory of something, what they are doing is reactivating these facsimiles, and they can then re-experience all the perceptions stored in the facsimile, such as the taste, feeling, sight, and sound of the incident. In Scientology, this activity is Hubbard's description of thinking. As well, Hubbard also developed the idea that we are not just bodies with minds, but that our essence is a spiritual aspect, which lives forever, and which he labeled a thetan. He said that a thetan is the exact opposite of the physical universe we see and live in, because a thetan exists without any body or shape or matter, energy, space, or time. You can't see or hear or otherwise detect or measure a thetan directly because it has no common frame of reference to measure. But like a blowing wind, you can sense or detect a thetan's presence. A thetan is like a nothing that is a something. The existence of a thetan is the most fundamental thing that Scientologists have to... Oh, excuse me one moment. Thank you. The existence of a thetan is the most fundamental thing that Scientologists have to accept on faith alone, because obviously no one can prove a nothingness exists which has consciousness. Yet all of Scientology is predicated on the fact that thetans do exist. Once you've accepted that as an article of faith, the rest of Scientology can then begin. Hubbard went on to say that thetans are solely responsible for the very existence of the entire physical world. Thetans can create matter, energy, space, and time at will. In fact, he claimed that they do this all the time as a routine matter of course. Everything you will ever see or hear or sense is only here because thetans have created it and mutually agree it's here. Hubbard claimed that thetans create electrical currents and other manifestations of force and energy, and use these to control the body they own. He said that in Scientology, they had discovered a fixed electrical field surrounding the body, and that if this field is altered or adjusted by the thetan using electrical currents, the actual shape and structure of the body itself can be changed. In fact, he even said that by creating energy and thrusting it into a body, you could increase the mass of the body and actually make it gain weight. He went on to say that an actual experiment was done proving this, but there were never any published findings or peer review of this so-called experiment. It was really just another one of his useless stories. When it comes to the e-meter, Hubbard's claims go like this. The meter sends a tiny electrical current through a person's body, and the meter measures any resistance that current meets in its travels. The resistance comes from electrical disturbances which occur within or in close proximity to the person's body. The mental image pictures contained in the reactive mind are sheets of electrical energy, and when a person's attention goes onto these pictures, they can shift or change to alter the flow of the electric current, and this shows up on the meter. The various reactions that occur on the meter indicate different things about what is going on with the mental image pictures and the electrical charge connected with them. The idea is to get the person to recall the incidents and then, by applying Scientology procedures, get the person to release the electrical charge. The pictures are then not supposed to have any further influence over the person because the electrical charge is dissipated and literally erased out of existence. When the whole mass of mental image pictures in the reactive mind are gone and all the charge connected with them is released, the person is called a clear. And let me just check one thing here because, yes, perfect. Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't obscuring anything. So to get there, you have to go through hundreds of hours of Scientology auditing. So what is auditing doing? In the shortest description possible, auditing is trying to erase the charge contained in past traumatic episodes in your life and in your past lives. As we went over, this charge is stored in engrams. One of the classic examples in Dianetics is a person having a motorcycle accident. The pictures of that original accident include the sensation of pain, the image of the bike, sounds of the engine, and anything else going on in the background. Now, many years later, if the person hears that same kind of engine revving or sees similar motorcycles, their reactive mind goes into action and that picture of the accident comes back into play. This is called restimulation. When questions are asked in auditing, they are supposed to make the person recall or think of these pictures so that Scientology processes can then be run which get rid of the pictures. In other words, the auditor is purposefully re-stimulating the person's reactive mind, and the mass of those pictures then appear on the meter. Now, let's start actually looking at a real e-meter. Let's take a look at the e-meter and its parts. This is the needle. The meter is read by interpreting the back and forth movement of the needle when a person is connected. This is the tone arm. It regulates how much voltage the meter is sending out. It is adjusted throughout the session to keep the needle on the dial. The sensitivity of the needle is affected by this, the sensitivity knob. The range of the sensitivity is raised and lowered by the sensitivity booster. The sensitivity is usually set at the beginning of a session and is not touched after that. This dial over here is called the trim knob, and it's only used when the meter is being calibrated, not when someone is hooked up to the meter. These two cans, or electrodes, are connected with copper wire to the meter and the person by having them hold the cans in their hands. The meter emits a very tiny amount of voltage which is conducted over the surface of the skin. It's not a powerful enough charge to pierce the skin or damage anyone. All right, so why is it called a tone arm? Well, back in 1951, Hubbard wrote a book called Science of Survival about emotions. States like enthusiasm, boredom, anger, or grief were called tones. It was analogous to a musical tone scale. And Hubbard said that emotions were kind of like sounds. They had different vibrations, which could be measured on electronic devices and even replicated with the right electronic equipment. This was early Scientology stuff, and it's not really stressed very much anymore. But back during that time, when Volney Matheson invented the first e-meters, he put numbers on this dial that he thought would indicate different emotional levels of the person holding the cans. Hubbard later wrote that these numbers didn't really mean that and were just arbitrarily put on the tone arm. It may even have been Matheson who came up with the idea of using the word tones to describe emotions. That's a little unclear in the history. The tone arm's actual function is to increase or decrease the voltage being pumped out by the e-meter. According to Hubbard, mental image pictures have a tiny amount of mass, right? So when someone is holding the cans, the tone arm is moved up and down to indicate how much mass the electric current is running into. In other words, how much resistance the electric current is meeting in the body of the person holding the cans. The higher the tone arm, the more mental mass is being generated by the preclear, making it harder for the electric current to complete its circuit. At least this is what Scientologists are told. The needle is supposed to measure smaller or more minute changes in mental mass. Where the tone arm might indicate a whole pile of pictures that have been restimulated, the needle would indicate a specific picture or incident which the auditor will hunt down and get the preclear to tell him about. So what are these needle actions? Well, believe it or not, there are quite a few of them, and they all indicate different things. I'm not going to show you all 26 of them because it would take an hour to explain every single one. But these are the most important ones that are used in Scientology auditing. A dog. A cat. So first off, there is a fall, which is the main thing an auditor is looking for when trying to find something to deal with in the preclear. It's a motion of the needle from left to right in response to a question and can vary in size from a small fall to a long fall blowdown, where the needle not only falls, but it goes off the dial and the tone arm has to be lowered to bring it back. Next, we have a rise. A dog. Here we go. There it is. So while a fall is important, a rise is not. This is where the needle moves from right to left, and it's hardly ever given any attention at all. Now, the needle can really only go up and down. So besides falls and rises, what else could there be? Well, there are patterns, which Hubbard says indicate certain things. A theta bop is when the needle goes up and down over the same distance, sort of a rise stick, fall stick, rise stick, fall stick. And this is supposed to indicate that the person is spiritually bopping in and out of the body, or is recalling a time when he was doing this, such as thinking about death or dying or really wanting to leave somewhere. Like almost all of these patterns I'm going to describe, the theta bop doesn't last very long, sometimes only for a couple swings. A dirty needle is when the needle is sticking randomly back and ticking back and forth, and sometimes it can get very dirty. This indicates a person is upset or agitated, usually because the auditor is doing something the preclear finds really annoying, or because the preclear is thinking about something he doesn't want to say. From the auditor's point of view, a dirty needle tells the auditor that there is some secret the preclear doesn't want the auditor to know about, and he pursues it vigorously until the preclear coughs it up. A clean needle is the opposite and simply indicates the preclear is not really thinking or doing much of anything. Okay, now a floating needle is the most desired needle pattern. It indicates that a process or action is completed. It's a rhythmic sweep of the dial at a slow, even pace of the needle, back and forth like that. It can last for a couple of swings, or it can go on and on and on. It generally indicates the preclear is happy or even euphoric in that moment, Although intriguingly, this same needle pattern can also occur when a person feels very sad or overwhelmed or upset. And then there is the rock slam. This is the most dreaded pattern in Scientology. It's a crazy, frantic slashing or slamming of the needle in an erratic pattern as though the meter has gone haywire. In fact, because rock slams can occur because of mechanical errors, the first thing an auditor does if he sees one is to disconnect the preclear and do a mechanical check on the meter. According to Hubbard, if a rock slam appears, it means that you've hit some hidden evil intention on the part of the preclear. And you'd have to write it all down very, very carefully and then later on use Scientology special procedures to go back and erase that evil intention. Yeah. All right. So those are the most important needle actions. But one thing to keep in mind is that this didn't all appear all at once as a done deal in 1951. The use of the meter developed over the years, and so did the meter reactions and what they mean. The first lectures on the meter were given in March of 1951, and the first operator's manual for it was issued in June, called Electropsychometric Auditing. And it was in the opening line of that manual where Hubbard made one of his most honest statements about the meter, that it is operationally the same as a lie detector as used by police and in psychological laboratories. One of the ways Hubbard established himself as an authority in Scientology, and especially in electronics, was by insinuating a hidden knowledge of past civilizations which had used electronics to enslave not only whole populations, but thetans too. Hidden or secret knowledge is almost universally the basis for any destructive cult, and Scientology is no exception. For example, Hubbard derided psychiatry for electric shock therapy, but then stated on page 1 of his e-meter manual that he knew of a way to treat psychosis using electric fields, which would make them well. I guess it never occurred to him to share this information with anyone in the medical profession so that they could start treating their patients rationally and effectively. No, apparently Hubbard preferred having his own monopoly on mental healing. Over the years, Hubbard's explanations changed for what an e-meter was actually measuring. At first, he likened the meter to a polygraph or lie detector, claiming that lie detectors worked but only appeared to fail because people in general have guilty consciences and because polygraph operators didn't know the right questions to ask. Quote, "The title and operation of the police lie detector are misnomers. In the first place, they do not detect lies. And in the second place, the police have known too little about the human mind to know that their instrument was actually accurate to an amazing perfection. These instruments should be called emotion detectors. And they do not have vagaries or errors. And used with a knowledge of the human mind and its actual history, they demonstrate an accuracy which borders on the incredible." Hubbard then went on to claim that the machine registers emotional charge, as in electrical charge, connected with incidents of stress or high emotional content. A proof of this, quote, that the charge recorded by a lie detector is the emotional residual in the emotion residual in the actual moment of the commission of the crime, was worked out and put into action by myself in 1947. On before and after lie detector tests on the same crime, it was first shown that the criminal, according to the machine, and very correctly, was guilty of a certain crime. The incident of the crime itself was then addressed by Dianetic processing, and the entire charge of emotion removed from the incident. After tests then showed no machine reaction, although the criminal was just as guilty and just as surely faced punishment if apprehended in that guilt by the machine. In the after tests, the criminal lied. He stated that he had not committed the crime, The lie detector agreed with him. All right. Now, these claims demonstrate Hubbard's style as a, quote, scientist, which would be repeated over and over again through the years of Scientology. He said he conducted an experiment with all of one test subject and then pronounced some vast new discovery, in this case about the nature of emotion and crime. It's doubtful that this experiment ever even happened. According to Russell Miller's biography, the year 1947 was one of Hubbard's least productive. He began the year in New York, married to 2 different women, moved to Seattle to eventually file for divorce from his first wife while scandalously parading his second around in front of her, and ended up in Los Angeles begging for a pension from the VA because he claimed to be so injured by his non-existent war wounds that he couldn't work. He managed to write a few stories which allowed him to barely get by financially, but there is no record anywhere of him taking time to experiment with criminals and lie detector tests, nor any reason for him to be doing such work when he was so desperately trying to make money by other means. There's no proof Hubbard ever even owned or knew how to operate a polygraph. All right, let me just check in with you guys here and see how we're doing. Okay, cool. Yes, exactly. All right. So even if he had done such an experiment, it would not have been conclusive evidence that emotional charge dissipates by talking about an incident of stress or trauma simply because one person didn't register on a lie detector when talking about a crime he committed. Regardless, Hubbard charged forward, and in the next paragraph of the operator's manual, he made this radical assertion. Quote, "It has been thought that a galvanometer measured the sweat exuded and thereby increased electrical conductivity of the hands. This does not hold up under examination. The galvanometer measures actually the density of the body. Under various stresses, the body is more or less dense, and the density alters swiftly. Density naturally influences the ability of the body to conduct electricity. Thus, the galvanometer portion of a lie detector measures density resistance of the body. A glance at a man showing anger will show you his increase in physical tension. He is giving more resistance to his environment. When a trickle of electricity is going through him, he is capable of changing its flow by changing his density." Okay. This rather, let's say, creative explanation was the beginning of Hubbard's alteration of reality in telling Scientologists what exactly the meter measures. But truth be told, back in the 1950s and 60s, no one really cared very much about Hubbard's explanations. The e-meter was not a precision instrument, and it wasn't treated as one. It was merely a gimmick or an aid to auditing, and often the auditors didn't even look at it when they had it up on the table during sessions. They were more interested in what their pre-clear was saying and how he looked and felt, and they used the e-meter simply to verify what they felt they already knew as to how things were going. In 1959, Hubbard had relocated his family to a palatial estate in East Grinstead, England, and established the International Center for Scientology Operations at his new home dubbed St. Hill Manor. He opened up his home to auditor trainees from around the world and began what ended up being a years-long series of technical briefings and studies, which are known as the St. Hill Special Briefing Course. Hubbard and the students tested out new Scientology procedure, and 2 to 3 times a week, Hubbard gave technical lectures to them about the latest breakthroughs. Many times, the e-meter was the subject of those lectures, and over time, Hubbard tightened up the discipline and exactness of meter use in auditing. It was no longer something that was to just sit idly on the auditing desk, but in fact became a vital tool to determine what subjects to take up with the pre-clear in his auditing. From this point forward, most forms of auditing became heavily dependent on the meter and its reactions. As part of this, Hubbard developed a series of drills which students practiced to be able to make the meter respond in auditing, recognize when it responded, and what those responses meant. Auditors were trained with coaches watching over their shoulders to make sure they were reading the meter properly. Not only did metering become more precise, but the whole auditing procedure itself also became much more formalized. Questions and commands became very specific and were not just made up on the spot anymore by the auditors. Hubbard had written many processes and procedures, but until this point, auditors had pretty much decided themselves what to run and when to run it. Now, auditing sessions began to be modeled very specifically so they looked the same from one auditor to another, with precise things said at the beginning, middle, and end of each session to make them easier to teach and more predictable for the pre-clears. This basic framework for a session was called model session. Auditors were furnished with specific questions to check before each session was started and instructed to say, "This is the session," when they began auditing, so the pre-clear would know precisely when the auditing started. In other words, the 1960s at St. Hill were a time when Scientology became a much more formal and stylized practice. There was a huge change implemented in 1960. Hubbard began insisting that the only needle reactions which really mattered were what he called instant reads, meaning the meter was supposed to respond at the exact instant the auditor was done asking a question or giving a command. Reads which were even a second or two after were to be ignored. Just like processes had been a bit more loosey-goosey in their application, so too was the use of the e-meter. Hubbard noted they would ask a question and then wait for 2, 3, or even 10 seconds after the question was asked. Hubbard called this waiting for the meter to play Dixie, and he canceled that practice. Another rule in auditing that became hardbound was that processes or procedures run on pre-clears in auditing were not complete until the needle was floating. Hubbard said a pre-clear had to continue to be run on a process until they not only felt and looked good about it, but that they had experienced a new realization about life and the needle had to be floating. This was supposed to indicate no more charge on the subject, at least for now. Oh, sorry about that. Now, what this really did, go back over here for a second. What this really did was usher in a whole new methodology that allowed Hubbard to reinforce the use of the e-meter as a kind of sacred science, a device that could never be questioned. If an auditor was not getting the proper responses Hubbard described, it was now the auditor's fault for failing to be able to get the meter to read. In other words, Hubbard tuned things up so that the meter was perfect, and it was only the humans using it who could be at fault if something didn't go as planned. So, what does an e-meter look like in action? Well, let's take a look at a couple examples of actual procedures used in Scientology auditing. The first thing we'll demonstrate is called a can squeeze. It's done at the beginning of almost every action in Scientology which uses the meter to establish the correct needle sensitivity for the person at that time. All right. Squeeze cans, please. Thank you. Squeeze cans, please. Thank you. Looked like just a little bit harder than the last one. Squeeze cans, please. Great. Perfect. That was perfect. After sensitivity is established for the session, a metabolism check is done. The idea is that the meter can confirm whether a person has had enough food and enough rest to have the necessary energy to get through an auditing session. I was not able to find any reference anywhere to indicate how it is that this is a valid test of basal metabolism, but this is what Scientologists do. All right, we're going to do a metabolism check. Take a deep breath, hold it for just a moment, and let it out through your mouth. Thank you. One way the meter is used often in Scientology is to do an assessment. A question is asked, but instead of having the person answer verbally, various possible answers are asked to see if the meter responds to any of them. In another version, the pre-clear is asked a question and gives a number of possible answers, but then the auditor notes them down and then assesses them back to the pre-clear. Either way, the meter's reactions are noted down on the list, and the one with the biggest reaction is the right answer. In this example, we're using a list that is assessed as a training exercise just to show how it looks. What country would you like to live in? United Kingdom, Ireland, Sweden, Denmark, Belgium, Spain, Germany, Switzerland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Greece, Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Yemen. Your item is Belgium. Now, we're going to show an actual Scientology auditing process being checked and run on the meter. These are almost always repetitive questions or commands, which are given over and over again until the pre-clear has a win or new realization about life and feels great. But processes aren't supposed to be run if they don't have any charge connected with them. So the first step is to check them on the meter and see if they read. If they do, then they can be run. Now, here's an interesting point. If the question doesn't read when asked, then the auditor can do an additional action called putting in a button. There are quite a few buttons, but the most common two are suppressed and invalidated. Without getting into a lot of explanation, the basic idea is maybe the pre-clear is suppressing some thought or invalidating some thought, and that could be keeping the meter from reacting when it should be. By checking the button, that's supposed to dig up that hidden charge. So here's what that actually looks like. All right. We are going to check this process and see whether we're going to be running it or not. What does this question mean to you? What are you willing for me to talk to you about?
You're asking me what it is I want to talk about with you.
Yeah, great. All right. And what does this question mean to you? What would you like me to tell you about that?
Like what I want you to talk about?
And could you be a bit more specific?
About the first question.
Right. Excellent. Okay, very good. So I'm going to check this question now. What are you willing for me to talk to you about? On what are you willing for me to talk to you about? Has anything been suppressed? On what are you willing for me to talk to you about? Has anything been invalidated? On what are you willing for me to talk to you about? Has anything been misunderstood? What would you like me to tell you about that? On what would you like me to tell you about that? Has anything been suppressed? All right. What are you willing for me to talk to you about?
My job.
Great.
What would you like me to tell you about that?
Whether or not I'm going to keep it.
Great. All right. What are you willing for me to talk to you about?
My family.
Excellent. And what would you like me to tell you about that?
Um,
That was a typical Scientology process. But now let's take a look at a Scientology confessional, otherwise called a security check. This has its own special procedure, which is different from other Scientology processes. Questions are checked on the meter, but there are only two possible outcomes. The question reads, or the needle floats. Until the needle floats, the security checker uses the question and various buttons to try to get it to read. Here's a demonstration of checking a question, getting a read on it, and then getting all the information about the overt. The question being asked is taken from a real Scientology security check. What does this question mean to you? Have you ever embezzled money?
you're asking if I've ever stolen money?
That's right, but what is embezzling?
Like stealing from a company or, especially if it's like your own company.
Exactly. So that's kind of what we're looking for here. And how would this question apply to your life? What would this encompass within your existence?
I mean, I've never embezzled money, so I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, just in terms of how could it apply to your life? Have you ever had a job where you've dealt with money?
Yeah.
Okay. And what would it look like if you were to embezzle money?
I mean, the closest thing to that would be like when I was a cashier. I guess I could have stole money out of the cash register, or when I was working at MoneyGram, I could have sent money to myself.
Well, exactly. All right. Well, we're going to check this question now. Have you ever embezzled money? On the question, have you ever embezzled money, has anything been suppressed? On the question, have you ever embezzled money, has anything been invalidated? On the question, have you ever embezzled money, is there anything you've been careful of? On the question, have you ever embezzled money, has anything nearly been found out? On the question, have you ever embezzled money, is there anything you failed to reveal? On the question, have you ever embezzled money, has anything been not ised? On the question, have you ever embezzled money, is there anything you've been anxious about? On the question, have you ever embezzled money, has anything been protested? On the question, have you ever embezzled money, has anything been evaluated? On the question, have you ever embezzled money, has anything been unnecessary? On the question, have you ever embezzled money, has anything been asserted? Have you ever embezzled money?
No.
All right. Well, here's what I'd like you to do is just take a look and see if there might have been any kind of answer that came to mind when I was asking about this.
No.
Okay. Any instance of embezzling money from work, from somebody, some money you shouldn't have taken? Any little tickle of any kind of thought here? Something you might have done?
I'm not sure.
All right, well, let's take a look and see whether there might have been some time in some way where you might have embezzled money. Let's take a good look here.
No.
Okay, all right, take a look. Let's find it. Let's dig it up here. We got something on this, so.
Okay.
Yeah. So when did you embezzle some money?
Well, I guess I was sort of I wasn't sending money. There was these transactions when I worked for a wire transfer company that no one was picking up. And so I changed the names on those transactions to names of people I knew so they could go pick them up.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Okay, got it. And how about how much money was involved here?
A few thousand.
Okay, do we know exactly how much? Can we nail that down?
I think it's about 5.
About 5,000. Okay. Very good. Thank you for telling me about that. All right, so now what exactly did you do to embezzle that money there? You mentioned a computer and putting people's names in. Tell me, let's get into the details of this. What happened?
Well, I changed the names to people I knew and then had them go with their IDs and pick up the money.
Okay, thank you. And about how many people were we talking about?
About 3.
Okay. And had this been set up beforehand, or did these people just randomly get money from you?
No, they knew.
Okay, so it had been prearranged.
Yeah.
Got it. And when was that prearranging happening?
I mean, before I set everything up, I was like, hey, we should do this. And they were like, all right.
Cool, cool. Was that a day before or a week before?
A couple weeks before.
Okay, and then you went in and did it?
Yeah.
Okay, and when that happened, how did you go about doing that? You were at work, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Okay, and this was at MoneyGram?
Yes.
Okay, and so when you were there at work at MoneyGram, what happened that you went over to the computer? How'd you do it?
Oh, well, we had access to change names on transactions, so that's how I did it.
Okay, got it. So this was just part of your regular...
Yeah.
Okay, so you didn't have to go out of your way or get somebody's password or do something. It was just all on your account.
Yep.
Thank you. When was that?
10 or 15 years ago.
Okay, let's see if we can nail it down as precisely as possible. Was it 10 years ago, 11, 12? What year was it?
Well, like 15.
15 years.
Yeah.
All right, 15 years. Good. Do you happen to remember what time of the year it was?
Summer, maybe?
All right, good. Any month?
I don't remember the month.
Fine. Okay, do you happen to remember the day of the week when it happened?
I think it was the weekend.
Very good. Okay, Saturday, Sunday.
Yeah, something like that.
Well, that would have been the weekend. I was
Yeah.
wondering if you knew which one.
Oh, gosh, probably Saturday.
Okay, thank you. And where were you at the time?
Well, I mean, the location was in Denver of the center, but then the places where people were picking up were different stores and locations around town.
Right, but your actions were located at your workplace in Denver.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, anything more specific to where you were when you did this?
Just at the office.
Great, all right, thank you. Is that all of that overt?
What do you mean by that?
All of the overt. Have you told me everything about what you did?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And were there any consequences to this?
I got fired.
Oh, okay. So you got found out. Okay, good. Got it. Okay. And how, just out of sheer curiosity, really, how long after this happened did you get fired?
A few months.
Okay.
Started figuring it out.
Got it. Were you made to pay the money back?
No.
Okay. But they just let you go. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so is that now? Is that all of that?
Yeah.
All right. Have you justified that overt?
Yeah.
Okay, well, how did you justify it?
Then no one was paying up that money. Those transactions were what we called stale transactions, and they had just been sitting there for years and no one had picked them up. So if no one was picking them up, why not?
Oh, okay. I see now. Okay, how else do you justify it?
You know, if no one was going to miss it. If it has been sitting there for so long, who's going to miss it?
Sure. Okay, how else do you justify it?
My family needed money.
Excellent. Okay, how else do you justify it?
But justify it as my work didn't treat people very well, so especially their employees.
Sure. Okay, how else do you justify it?
That was about it.
Who missed it?
Well, at first, I wasn't sure if my bosses knew, but, you know, then they started monitoring me more and started asking me questions and going to HR a lot. And
Oh, so there were multiple instances of this.
yeah.
Okay, so let's take these one at a time. So the first time that they were asking questions, what was it that was done exactly to make you wonder whether or not they knew?
It was sort of like there was emails going around, or they're like, you know, if you see this suspicious activity, talk about it. And I was like, well, that sounds familiar.
Right. Okay, what else did your boss do specifically to make you wonder whether or not he knew?
Well, let me see. Just sort of like asking me a lot of questions about it, like if I knew about stuff going on, and you know, like I said, they started monitoring me more and, you know, asking to review my work more.
Right. Good. All right. Any other instances of your boss nearly finding out or making you feel like he nearly found out?
Not that I can think of.
Okay. Who else missed it?
I feel like maybe my coworkers might have.
Okay, let's take them one at a time. Which coworker first?
I feel like one of them was like making a joke that made me wonder, like, haha, I bet it would be funny to send money to someone, these stale transactions that no one knows about.
Right, right. Which coworker was that?
This guy, Joe.
Joe. Okay, very good. What else did Joe do anything else to make you wonder whether or not he knew?
No.
Okay. And you mentioned other coworkers?
Well, just him, really.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Did anybody else miss this withhold?
I don't think so.
Okay, no one else. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there an earlier similar time you embezzled money? All right. So finally, I have one more demonstration for you of the meter in action. This is called a correction list. It's a list of questions that are assessed if some trouble occurs in a session that can't be resolved easily. The meter is resorted to in order to dig up what is really going on. And the questions on the list are supposed to represent every single thing that could possibly go wrong in that kind of auditing. Different styles of auditing have different correction lists, and the one we're going to show here is for a security check. As you can imagine, most of the questions have to do with the pre-clear hiding something. Here's what an assessment of a correction list would look like. There is some Scientology jargon on this list, and we're not going to clear that up because that's not really what we're trying to show with what the meter is doing here. So here you go. All right, we're going to be doing a confessional repair list to see what's going on here in the session. I'm going to prefix each of these questions with "in this session." All right, so that's where I want you to have your attention. We're not looking at other things than just that.
Okay.
Very good. In this session, out int. In this session, list error. In this session, wrong item. In this session, was there an ARC break? In this session, was there a problem? On the question in this session, was there a problem? Has anything been suppressed? On the question in this session, was there a problem? Has anything been invalidated? In this session, was a withhold missed? In this session, did you tell part of a withhold but not the rest? In this session, did you misdirect the auditor? In this session, did you misdirect the auditor?
I guess kind of.
Okay, tell me what happened.
Well, I mean, my family sort of put me up to the whole thing, and I didn't say that. I didn't necessarily want to do it, but...
Oh, okay. Is this in reference to the embezzling thing?
Yeah.
Got it. Oh, your family put you up to it.
Yeah, I was talking about it and joking about it, and they were like, well, we should really do that. And then they kind of convinced me.
Got it. Okay, so we didn't really talk about that.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. All right, well, let's go ahead and take this up then. So what exactly happened there?
Well, one day I was joking about it, and I was like, yeah, you could get away with that. And I wasn't serious. But then, my siblings were like, well, we need money and you need money and our parents are hurting, so let's do something.
Great. Okay, thank you for telling me about that. All right, let's go ahead and run that through. And that is what Scientology actually looks like when it's done according to Hubbard's directions. So now that we've given you an overview of what the meter is and the basics of its use in Scientology, let's start debunking this thing. We've already commented critically about a number of Hubbard's claims, but we've got more to cover. Believe it. All right, part 4, time to debunk the meter. Based on what you've seen so far, you now have an idea of the right way to use a meter according to Scientology. And if I left it at this, then everything you looked at from here on with an e-meter would be interpreted against what I've shown you. And you might actually even start thinking that there's some validity to its reactions. So now I have to unteach you all that so you get what's really going on. And I'm going to start by first filling you in on some information that I purposefully left out and which Hubbard did not want Scientologists to know. First, as usual, let's do a little history lesson. The wonders of electricity and its relationship to living organisms was the subject of what is considered the first science fiction novel ever, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818. I was looking for an early cover and I only came up with that one. As scientific advances continued, psychology and psychiatry became formalized subjects by 1879. In 1888 was the first demonstration of galvanic skin response. And by 1906, Freud's pupil, Carl Jung, became curious whether galvanic skin response could be useful for gaining psychological insight into his patients. So what is galvanic skin response? Well, our skin is a complete organ, just like our stomach or our liver. Have you ever noticed that your skin and your gut change when your emotions change? Our stomach does flippy floppies and we can break out in a sweat when we get angry or nervous or excited. But often these physiological reactions are something we don't even notice because we're so consumed with the thoughts and feelings that are swirling around in our brain. There are more sweat glands in our palms, head, and the soles of our feet than anywhere else. And when we are aroused, these produce microsecretions of salt water, which change the electrical conductivity of those areas. When the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, that is also because of a change in the electrical state of your skin. Since these changes seem to come from changes in thinking and emotions, it was posited that maybe by running a current over the skin and measuring the change in resistance, something could be found out about the person's mental state. This measurement is called galvanic skin response, or GSR. More recently, it's referred to as EDA, which stands for electrodermal activity. It's defined as the property of the human body that causes continuous variation in the electrical characteristics of the skin. Jung read a list of words to people who were connected to a GSR device, consisting of a simple battery which passed a current through probes held by the patient, and a needle registered the electrical charge, or changes. What Jung came to realize almost immediately was that not only did needle movement not tell the device operator what was going on, but that the reactions could be coming from any number of sources, and it was impossible to tell just by looking at a needle moving about what the patient was actually thinking or feeling. In other words, there was nothing the GSR device could reveal that couldn't be found with more rapidity and certainty by simply asking the patient to talk about what was on their mind. The only thing the needle movement indicated was a heightened state of emotional arousal, meaning more activity in the parasympathetic nervous system, which in turn is reflected in sweat and muscle tension. What exactly was causing the state of arousal was anyone's guess and could only be sorted out by talking to the person. The machine really didn't indicate anything, and it certainly didn't indicate whether the person was telling the truth or not. A lie could cause a person to become agitated, but so could the nature of the question, the subject under discussion, the color of the psychiatrist's jacket, or an upset stomach the person had. There was just no way to tell just by looking at the needle. An additional variable, which Scientologists almost uniformly ignore, is that because the e-meter is connected to the body using tin-plated cans, the tightness of a person's grip and the way they hold or loosen their grip changes the electrical resistance significantly. Microtensions in a person's hands can generate reactions that are mistaken for mental or physiological changes. No matter how well trained an e-meter operator is, they can easily miss this, especially because their training biases them to look for certain meter reactions and interpret them in specific ways. I personally witnessed people convincingly fake a floating needle or reeds many times over the years. And the only reason anyone found out is because they confessed to what they'd done. Despite Jung's earlier failure, and without a single shred of evidence, Matheson and Hubbard both insisted that GSR was an accurate measurement of thought, and that stress or trauma could be differentiated from regular thinking using a GSR device. Here is a sample procedure with both Hubbard and Matheson's name on it, with just one example of what I'm talking about. This was the basis of Matheson's original meters and the entire foundation of Hubbard's claims about the e-meter. But let's be clear. The e-meter is nothing more than a very fancy version of the primitive battery and needle setup that Jung tested and rejected over a century ago. This has been verified by electronics experts in and out of in the Scientology world. But as anyone who has tried to tell one of your friends that their magic crystals might not be everything promised, the myth about GSR and our minds continues to this day. Now, compare this with a polygraph, the infamous lie detector. This machine measures a number of physical responses, including GSR, but also heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure. You'd think if GSR alone can give you a window into a person's thoughts and stress reactions, then adding these other measures should reveal everything about a person. But that's not even remotely true. There are many opinions about the workability and veracity of polygraphs. But the fact is that they are not admissible in any court of law for the very easily proven reason that they are wholly unreliable and require the subjective interpretation of a human being to read a polygraph result. The admissions and confessions a trained polygraph operator get from their subjects depends more on their skill at interrogation and coaxing the person to talk, not the pinpoint accuracy of the polygraph. And any competent polygraph operator will tell you that themselves. Let's say someone is visibly or obviously responding uncomfortably to being questioned about whether they cheated on their spouse while connected to a polygraph. The needle bounces around, their blood pressure goes up, and they become very agitated. Does that mean they're lying about their fidelity? Of course not. Anyone who would say that nervous agitation is a sure sign of lying is someone who has no business being anywhere near this work. The fact is, there could be all kinds of reasons why someone would be nervous and agitated being asked about their marriage, including that they come from a broken home full of traumatizing abuse, that they're socially awkward and are nervous whenever they're being questioned, that they have a deep hatred for any authority figures, or they could love their spouse with all their heart and be internally conflicted about the fact that this test is even happening and poses a threat to their marriage no matter what they say. Do you see what I mean? It could be one of these, it could be more than one of these, or something else entirely. But what isn't on the list of reasons for this person's discomfort is that they're lying, because they aren't. So let's just call a spade a spade. Changes in body temperature, heart rate, sweat response, and breathing indicate heightened arousal. But what is causing that can't be reduced down to a simple black and white proposition. And I think you know that if you were put in that position, you would never want people to judge you based on the reactions of some machine without even being given a chance to explain yourself. Yet, that is what lie detectors are used for, and that is what is done with them all over the United States today in job interviews, military promotions, or personnel transfers, civil and criminal cases, and other situations. Researchers in Tel Aviv have even recently started looking into using AI to read so-called micro-expressions in people's faces to detect when they're telling the truth. This simplistic notion that complicated human beings who are motivated by hundreds, if not thousands of different variables in every moment of our lives can be reduced down to simple truth or false based on our physiological reactions alone is pure nonsense. And I haven't even tried to broach the subject of cultural, ideological, and language differences influencing a polygraph result. Let me also point out that every test to use mechanical means to detect lies, even brain scans, can be beaten by a human who is prepared to do so. In a 2019 paper, researchers from the University of Plymouth showed that people using mental countermeasures could deceive fMRI-based lie detector tests. Not all lie detector operators are shady manipulators who push a pseudoscientific approach, but some are. Every polygraph operator in the world is a human being who can and does often suffer from confirmation bias. They see in the readings of the polygraph what they expect to see or want to see and interpret it accordingly. That is a human fallibility and is not a moral judgment. However, at the same time, we have to acknowledge that many of these polygraph operators are happy to sell their services to the highest bidder to destroy people's relationships, careers, or even put people behind bars unjustly. And that is not right. Lie detectors have also been used by police, the military, and intelligence agencies around the world for many reasons, including pure psychological pressure and manipulation to get a confession from an innocent person who could be convinced that anything they say or try will just result in their guilt. The potential for abuse has been realized many times, and yet this machine continues to be used indiscriminately and without any real scientific accuracy. So knowing all that, do you really believe an even simpler device like an e-meter is somehow giving Scientology auditors a window into a person's soul and their past lives? I don't. But I'm not done yet. There's more to debunking the e-meter beyond its parallels with polygraph machines. Let's talk about human memory now. Hubbard's model of human memory and mental image pictures is simply wrong. He basically invented mental constructs and frameworks which don't exist in reality and which are far too simplistic to explain the full range of our complex behavior. Let's talk about memory in terms that go beyond Hubbard's idea that the brain is just a highly developed video camera. Put all of Hubbard's pseudoscientific nonsense aside for a moment and let's talk real science. Here is what neuroscientist David Eagleman recently wrote about human memory. Quote, "Consider memory. Nature seems to have invented mechanisms for storing memory more than once. For instance, under normal circumstances, your memories of daily events are consolidated, that is, cemented in by an area of the brain called the hippocampus. But during frightening situations, such as a car accident or a robbery, another area, the amygdala, also lays down memories along an independent secondary memory track. Amygdala memories have a different quality to them. They're difficult to erase and they can pop back up in flashbulb fashion, as commonly described by rape victims and war veterans. In other words, there is more than one way to lay down memory. We're not talking about a memory of different events, but multiple memories of the same event, as though two journalists with different personalities were jotting down notes about a single unfolding story. So we see that different factions in the brain can get involved in the same task. In the end, it's likely that there are even more than two factions involved, all writing down information and later competing to tell the story. The conviction that memory is one thing is an illusion. It appears that memory is reconstructed in the moment, but as Eagleman noted, it's not one monolithic operation in your brain. And the accuracy of these memories is highly variable from one person to the next. and even from 1 year to the next as our brains age or deteriorate. This idea that there are sheets of energy in an electrical field around our body storing our perceptions is total nonsense. Now, what is restimulation? Emotions have been posited to be internal physiological reactions that happen before any rational thought or reasoning is present or even aware of what's happening. The intellect responds to these emotionally driven physiological changes by trying to catch up and figure out what's going on and go along for the ride. But the intellect is not the thing that is determining the emotional response, nor is it capable of changing or altering that initial response. This is one way of describing the fight or flight response. But our survival does not have to be on the line for us to experience strong emotions. It's not something you think about or have any rational control over. An e-meter is registering a change in muscle tension and sweat, which can be brought about by these aroused unconscious impulses. As you saw earlier, Hubbard flat out denied that this would have anything to do with meter reactions. Further, if we look into neuroscience, we can find a plausible explanation for how a brain could respond to painful or traumatic experiences from the past, and we don't have to invent mental image pictures or reactive minds. Now, this is a little complicated, but I'm going to just quote directly from neuroscientist David Eagleman again, where he discusses an experiment measuring galvanic skin response when making choices about picking cards from different decks and how the brain could subconsciously start figuring out patterns in those cards before the person's so-called conscious mind was aware of it. Considering what we've talked about today with GSR and the e-meter, this experiment is almost too on the nose. But Eagleman didn't write this with Scientology in mind at all. I believe this is the real explanation for Hubbard's writings about restimulation. Quote, "The investigators also measured the subject's skin conductance response, which reflects the activity of the autonomic fight or flight nervous system. And here they noticed something amazing. The autonomic nervous system picked up on the statistics of the deck well before a subject's consciousness did. That is, when subjects reached for the bad decks, there was an anticipatory spike of activity, essentially a warning sign. This spike was detectable by about the 13th card draw. So some of the subjects' brains were picking up on the expected return from the decks well before the subjects' conscious minds could access that information. And the information was being delivered in the form of a hunch. Subjects began to choose the good decks even before they could consciously say why. This means that conscious knowledge of the situation was not required for making advantageous decisions. Even better, it turned out that people needed the gut feeling. Without it, their decision-making would never be very good. Damasio and his colleagues ran the card choice task using patients with damage to the frontal part of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, an area involved in making decisions. The team discovered that these patients were unable to form the anticipatory warning signal of the galvanic skin response. The patients' brains simply weren't picking up on the statistics and giving them an admonition. Amazingly, even after these patients consciously realized which decks were bad, they still continued to make the wrong choices. In other words, the gut feeling was essential for advantageous decision making. This led Damasio to propose that the feelings produced by physical states of the body come to guide behavior and decision making. Body states become linked to outcomes of events in the world. When something bad happens, the brain leverages the entire body, heart rate, contraction of the gut, weakness of the muscles, and so on, to register that feeling. And that feeling becomes associated with the event. When the event is next pondered, the brain essentially runs a simulation, reliving the physical feeling of the event. Those feelings then serve to navigate or at least bias subsequent decision making. If the feelings from a given event are bad, they dissuade the action. If they're good, they encourage it. In this view, physical states of the body provide the hunches that can steer behavior. These hunches turn out to be correct more often than chance would predict, mostly because your unconscious brain is picking up on things first and your consciousness lags behind. In fact, conscious systems can break entirely with no effect on the unconscious systems. People with a condition called prosopagnosia cannot distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar faces. They rely entirely on cues such as hairlines, gait, and voices to recognize people they know. Pondering this condition led researchers Daniel Trenell and Antonio Damasio to try something clever. Even though prosopagnostics cannot consciously recognize faces, would they have a measurable skin conductance response to faces that were familiar? Indeed, they did. Even though the prosopagnostic truly insists on being unable to recognize faces, some part of his brain can and does distinguish familiar faces from unfamiliar faces. In other words, you don't need to have a reactive mind or engrams to experience unease, discomfort, or even physical pain for no reason that makes any sense to you. Your brain can simply alert you on a subconscious level that things in your environment may not be good for you, and you will feel compelled to act without even fully understanding why. Your rational mind may well come up with completely false or wrong reasons why you feel that way. It doesn't matter. The brain is just doing its job of trying to keep you alive. So we come to the last point about how an e-meter works, the instant read. I mentioned earlier that Hubbard made this big change in 1960 where any reactions an auditor was going to take up had to occur at the precise end of the major thought voiced by the auditor to the pre-clear out loud. This isn't really how GSR works, as there's usually a lag of 1 or a few seconds between a statement and the body's reaction to it. That's why Hubbard had to invent not only instant reads, but also buttons. Remember in the video earlier where I asked a security check question and then asked a bunch of more times using suppressed, invalidated, failed to reveal, asserted, etc. Why do all that? Because every time you do, you get another shot at a random reaction to hit at just the right moment to believe the question has produced a reaction which the auditor needs to take up. I demonstrated how this looks in a regular session, but I actually downplayed it a bit. Those questions and buttons can be checked over and over and over again. I have sat in an auditing session for 5 or 10 straight minutes doing nothing at all, while the auditor just sat there over chanting out the question and using all the buttons to try to get it to react. And eventually, some random reaction would happen, and my confirmation bias as a pre-clear would kick in, and I'd dutifully find an answer to the question. This also explains another instruction Hubbard gave to all auditors in training, which is universally applied in Scientology. The auditor has to bark his commands to the pre-clear in order to startle them so the meter will react. It's not the pre-clear's reactive mind that's responding. It's the fact that they were startled or shocked by the auditor shouting at them. The sudden adrenaline rush is what creates the meter response. And finally, here's my explanation for the wildest and most insane needle reaction, the rock slam. Remember that needle flying all over the dial? Why would it do that? Because it's a broken meter. It's actually that simple. While meter quality and the reliability of the parts used to make them was a serious issue throughout the lifetime of the e-meter, the parts used these days are actually pretty good. But when they were bad, they could be really bad. And if some dirt or dust got into the mechanism controlling the tone arm, it could cause the meter to go haywire. Now, I admit that this is an informal survey, but in doing research for this video, I spoke with around 25 different former Scientologists who had all been trained in Scientology security checking and had engaged in hundreds or even thousands of hours of it. Some of them had overseen the auditing of others as well. Not one of them had ever witnessed a legitimate rock slam. And by legitimate, I don't mean they never saw an e-meter go wild. I mean they couldn't say the same words to the person or ask them about the same area or subject matter and get the rock slam to come back. If a rock slam is supposed to indicate an evil purpose on the subject under discussion, then it should be a pretty easy matter of talking about that subject to get it to come back. Certainly interrogating the person with hard questions about that subject should restimulate it. But it never worked out in real life. I myself am aware of 4 different instances throughout my time in the Sea Org where a rock slam was artificially created or faked by the meter operator or the person holding the cans for their own reasons. They knew exactly what they were doing and what would happen, and they went ahead and did it anyway, usually repeatedly touching the cans together to close the electric circuit so the needle would go crazy. This also happens if a person is wearing a ring or touches the cans to some other metal object like a bracelet. The rock slam indicates a hidden evil intention. And over the many years of Scientology, perhaps thousands of people have been punished and sent to Scientology's re-education camps because of a rock slam. I am convinced, after doing the years of research that this video entailed, that there has never once been a valid rock slam. They were just broken meters that ended up ruining people's lives. And so we reach the conclusion of this video. We have covered both Matheson and Hubbard's pseudoscientific descriptions and explanations for what an e-meter is and does, and we have then covered the actual science governing these devices. The differences could not be more stark. Hubbard said meters indicate changes in an invisible electronic field around your body impinged upon by electrical charge your thetan creates in the moment based on your past life traumas. Or, and I know it's hard to accept, the meter is just showing areas of emotional arousal, which in and of itself means absolutely nothing until the person holding the cans actually tells you what is happening. It is not only impossible to determine if the person is lying, it actually sets up a situation of psychological pressure where the meter can be used to intimidate a person into confessing to things they never did or fabricating memories out of pure imagination to satisfy Hubbard's space opera narratives. The Scientology e-meter is simply a device that has helped Hubbard and the Church of Scientology to swindle literally billions of dollars from unsuspecting people who just wanted to live a happier and healthier life. When you look at it plainly, it is perhaps the sickest of jokes that human beings put so much faith in electronic tools to tell them what's going on in the hearts and minds of others, you know, instead of just talking to them or asking them what's on their mind. I hope today's video has clarified the situation and empowered you to know just how far some people, like L. Ron Hubbard, are willing to go to pull the wool over your eyes and take you for every dime you have before leaving you broke, alone, and ruined. Predators like Hubbard and the church's current leader, David Miscavige, are a dime a dozen. They are not praiseworthy or admirable or even good people. They are jackals who feed on the society around them, all the while working so hard to convince people that they are the angels among us. The Church of Scientology is a dying organization. It's a church in name only, a religion only because Hubbard lied from day one about what he was really about and what his true mission was. All he wanted was for people to idolize and even worship him. In the end, L. Ron Hubbard died alone and insane. His e-meter was of no use to him, and in fact, he even wanted a special one built that would zap the ghosts he believed existed all around him. Hubbard was a madman, not a messiah. He was a grifter, and the e-meter was one of his primary tools to con everyone. Now you know the truth about him and about this device. Thank you very much for watching. Bye, guys.